Everyone wants to be king, until they actually are. The idea of being a medieval monarch sounds glorious. Power, riches, castles, servants. Your word is law, your throne is gold, and your name echoes through history. But take one step into the real Middle Ages, and that crown you dreamed of, it starts to feel less like a symbol of authority and more like a trap made of thorns. Because the truth is, being a king wasn't about resting on velvet pillows while people fed you grapes. It was about inheriting chaos, enemies at your gates, rivals in your family, starving peasants, corrupt nobles, and priests whispering that God was already disappointed in you. You didn't just get crowned, you got buried under centuries of political mess and handed a sword still slick with your predecessor's blood. Even the coronation, that dramatic moment when the crown is placed on your head, was more of a public gamble than a celebration. You were exposed, surrounded by powerful men who were watching you like vultures. Was your grip on the throne firm enough? Was your bloodline legitimate? Could you be manipulated or removed? And if your predecessor didn't die peacefully, that crown came stained. Maybe you were the third son, never meant to rule. Maybe your older brother had a hunting accident. Maybe your uncle vanished mysteriously, and everyone's too polite to mention it. But everyone knows the throne doesn't just sit empty. Someone always fills it, or kills for it. The moment you were crowned, the expectations started. You were supposed to lead the army, balance the treasury, enforce justice, protect the church, raise heirs, keep the nobles loyal, the peasants working, the enemies terrified, and all while not looking weak. Because if you showed weakness, that was blood in the water. And here's the kicker, your power wasn't as absolute as it seemed. Sure, you were God's chosen ruler, but most medieval kings couldn't sneeze without some noble bishop or chancellor, reminding them that God also works through councils, laws, and angry barons with private armies. Your every decision could be blocked, reversed, or questioned. Not always in public, but in backrooms filled with smirking advisors who only want what's best for the realm. You were never really alone, but you were never safe either. Your enemies were everywhere, some dressed in armor, others dressed in velvet. Your allies could switch sides at a moment's notice, and your own servants, they heard everything. A misplaced word could be passed along to someone who didn't like your new tax plan or your new queen. And if you ruled in a time of famine, plague, or war, your job became impossible. Starving peasants don't care about your royal seal. Sick populations blame you for God's wrath. Every lost battle becomes a scandal. Every unpopular decision gets pinned on your name. You don't just make policy, you become a scapegoat in a crown. Even peace didn't buy you peace. Nobles grow restless when there's no war to distract them. They start asking questions, demanding privileges, passing notes under the table. Every year without conflict is a year someone else has to wonder, why is he still king, anyway? And let's not forget your image. Being a king meant performing constantly. You had to project strength, wisdom, piety, generosity, mercy, ruthlessness, and fatherly concern, all while your back ached, your bladder screamed, and your court gossiped about whether your crown looked crooked today. You were less a man, more a symbol, a walking myth that everyone expected to behave like a saint and punish like a god. Slip up once, and you weren't forgiven. You were judged by the nobles, by the church, by your rivals, and by history. And when the people were angry, when the crops failed or the war dragged on or taxes got too high, they didn't curse the weather or the generals. They cursed you, your name, your blood, your family. And the worst part? You probably didn't even want the job. Plenty of kings never asked for the throne. They were shoved into it by politics, inheritance, or violence. Some were children when crowned. Others were elderly. Some were completely unprepared. Scholars, warriors, or even sickly recluses, suddenly expected to hold together a crumbling realm with nothing but a sword and a speech. So no, being king wasn't a dream come true. It was a nightmare with good curtains. A gilded prison, surrounded by daggers and diplomacy, where every day could be your last, and every smile might be a trap. Because the crown didn't just make you powerful, it made you a target. And now that it's sitting on your head, heavy and hot, you realize something terrifying. The game has already started, and you don't know who the players are yet. Next, we'll explore how that pretty little crown on your head comes with more risk than reward, and how your very coronation might be your first mistake. They put the crown on your head and expect it to fit like destiny. But it doesn't. It's too heavy, too fragile, too sharp. And that's not a metaphor. Medieval crowns were often made of real gold, sometimes inset with jagged gems and stiff metal arches. They weren't designed for comfort. They were designed to impress, to intimidate, and to remind you and everyone else that your skull was now public property. But it's not just the weight of the metal that made it unbearable. It's the fact that the crown itself was rarely yours to shape. The moment it touched your head, you stopped being a person and became a figurehead in a machine you didn't build. And more often than not, the machine was already breaking down. The coronation ceremony itself was a mess of ritual, politics, and paranoia. You'd be anointed with holy oil, dressed in robes, and paraded before nobles and clergy, all while trying not to sweat through your tunic or throw up from nerves. You stood there as choirs sang, bishops preached, and the people shouted, "God save the king," even if half of them were secretly praying for your early demise. And let's talk about those bishops for a second. Because being king didn't mean you answered to no one. You answered to God. And in practice, that meant the church. That meant you were being crowned not just as a ruler, but as a divinely chosen servant. And if you ever stepped out of line, the same bishop who anointed you could turn around and say, "Actually, God changed his mind." Kings who clashed with the church got excommunicated. That meant no sacraments, no salvation, and politically speaking, no authority. Because if the Pope said you were illegitimate, half your kingdom would start writing letters to your cousin asking if he wanted to give the throne a try. And don't forget, a lot of kings weren't even raised to rule. You might have been the second or third son, never meant for the throne. Your older brother died in war, or from plague, or a suspicious accident, and suddenly you were wearing the crown. You had no training, no experience, just a nervous smile and 1,000 decisions you didn't understand waiting on your desk. Even kings who were born heirs had problems. Everyone had been watching you since birth, judging your posture, your handwriting, your tutors, your temperament. You were expected to be wise, brave, pious, just, educated, well-spoken, battle-tested, charming, and never tired, never afraid, never unsure. So you pretended. You faked confidence while your nobles eyed you like a meal. You made decisions you barely understood. You surrounded yourself with advisors who might be loyal or might be waiting for you to fail. You rehearsed every sentence before you said it out loud, knowing that every slip could end up quoted in a rebellion manifesto. And then came the backlash. Because no matter what kind of king you tried to be, you were always doing it wrong in someone's eyes. If you were too soft, they called you weak. If you were too harsh, they called you cruel. If you tried to raise taxes, they accused you of greed. If you forgave a traitor, they said you were foolish. If you executed a noble, they said you were unstable. Every decision was a trap, and there were no safe moves. You were expected to fix problems that had been festering for decades. Feuds between nobles, debt from previous wars, foreign enemies gaining ground, church-state tensions, peasant uprisings, trade disruptions, bad harvests, poisoned wells, missing coin, and at least 3 cousins who wanted you dead. And you had to do it all while staying calm, regal, and generous. That crown on your head? It didn't make you strong. It made you visible. A big shiny target, announcing to the world, blame me, question me, plot against me. Even your allies weren't really allies. They were supporters for now. Supporters who were watching you, testing you, waiting, and every day you ruled. The pressure mounted. Every victory made someone jealous. Every loss made someone ambitious. You were expected to be infallible, unshakable, untouchable, but you weren't. You were a man with a headache, a bad knee, a sick child, a tooth rotting in your skull, and a golden band on your brow that reminded you every single day, you can't ever put this down, because once you wore the crown, even if it never fit, there was only one way to take it off, and it usually wasn't peaceful. Next, we'll see why your own blood might be the first to come for that crown, Because being king didn't protect you from betrayal. In fact, it guaranteed it. If you thought your enemies were outside the castle walls, think again. Because in medieval politics, the most dangerous person in your kingdom was often your own kin, your brother, your uncle, your cousin, your own children, the ones with your blood in their veins, your name on their tongue, and your throne in their sights. From the moment you were crowned, your family stopped being a support system. They became a problem, sometimes a political one, sometimes a mortal one. Let's start with your siblings. In many kingdoms, the firstborn son inherited the throne, but that didn't mean the second, third, or fourth were okay with it. Not when they were just as royal, not when they had friends, soldiers, or loyal provinces of their own. These weren't harmless younger brothers, they were rival kings in waiting, and every time you stumbled, they saw an opportunity. History is littered with brothers turning on brothers. They raised armies, they forged alliances with enemies. They tried to discredit you, humiliate you, poison your court with whispers. Sometimes, they did worse. Actual poison, slipped into your wine, or a blade in the night during a hunting trip that suddenly felt a little too well planned. And then there were your uncles, the men who often helped advise young kings, or ruled as regents when the crown passed to a child. These uncles rarely gave up power willingly. Many of them enjoyed the throne too much to hand it off when the time came. So instead, they delayed, spread rumors, started campaigns of stability that just happened to push the real king further and further into the background. Some of them got creative. They forged documents. They claimed the current king was illegitimate. They even accused their own nephews of witchcraft, madness, or heresy. Anything to paint you as unfit to rule. And if you were a child king, you weren't just vulnerable, you were doomed. You were too young to fight back, too inexperienced to read through deception. You were a puppet, and your family was the one pulling the strings, until someone decided to cut them all together. That brings us to sons, the ultimate betrayal. Because kings didn't just fear their rivals, they feared their heirs. You raised your son to be a prince. You trained him in statecraft. You gave him titles, land, tutors. You brought him to court, let him witness your rule. And in doing so, you taught him everything he needed to know to take your throne from you. Sometimes it started with pressure. Father, when will you make me co-king? Why won't you let me command the army? When will I take over? Other times, it turned to resentment. You're old, you're weak, you're ruining the kingdom. And eventually, too often, it turned to open revolt. History is packed with sons who waged war on their own fathers. Prince versus king, bloodline versus bloodline. Some were even crowned in opposition, while their fathers were still alive. Others imprisoned their parents, exiled them, or watched them die. And what could you do? Execute your own child. Plenty of kings did, and then had to live with it. But even that wasn't the worst case. The worst case was when you didn't see it coming, when you trusted them, gave them power, laughed with them at dinner, and then woke up to the sound of swords being drawn outside your chambers. It was always the ones you let closest, because who else could get close enough? And don't forget the women of your family, your mother, your sister, your daughter, your wife. They weren't powerless. Many were politically savvy, deeply connected, and utterly ruthless. Queens sometimes plotted against kings. Sisters married your rivals. Mothers conspired for their more suitable sons. Daughters were married off as peace offerings, and came back carrying messages from your enemies. Royal families weren't families, they were minefields. Every relationship came with strings attached. Every visit came with rumors. Every dinner could end in betrayal. You couldn't show weakness, even at home. You couldn't trust affection, even from your own blood. Because every member of your family had something to gain by your downfall, and at least a few had the means to make it happen. You weren't a father, you were a stepping stone. You weren't a brother, you were an obstacle. And when you finally died, naturally or otherwise, your children would fight each other for what you left behind. The cycle didn't end with you, it just restarted with fresh blood. So no, your family wasn't your safety net. It was your first battlefield. Next, we'll explore how even eating and drinking as king was a risk. Because poison wasn't just a paranoid fear, it was a daily possibility. They say, heavy is the head that wears the crown. But heavier still is the cup that comes with it. Because being a medieval king didn't just mean giving orders and holding banquets. It meant living in a constant state of paranoia, especially at the dinner table. Because every time you ate, every time you drank, there was a chance it would be your last meal. Poison wasn't just a spy novel fantasy. It was a very real, very present threat in medieval courts. And if you were king, you were the prime target. You were the bottleneck for power. The one person who stood between an ambitious noble and everything he wanted. And that meant you were vulnerable, not just in battle, but at breakfast. Let's start with the food. Royal meals were lavish. Yes, multiple courses, exotic spices, roasted game, elaborate pies, goblets of rare wines, but that didn't make them safe. In fact, the more elaborate the meal, the more chances there were to slip something in, and poison came in many forms. Some poisons were fast, convulsions, vomiting, death within the hour. Others were slow, gradual sickness, loss of strength, confusion, a slow fade that looked like natural illness. The ingredients, you name it, arsenic, belladonna, hemlock, powdered glass, mercury, even crushed toads. They were mixed into stews, dusted on bread, stirred into wine. And you wouldn't notice because your meals weren't just cooked in a locked kitchen. They were handled by dozens of people, cooks, servants, tasters, butlers, pages, each one a potential link in the chain. Each one a potential assassin. That's why kings employed tasters, men who literally ate the food first to see if they died. Think about that. You were so afraid of being poisoned, you paid someone to get sick before you did. Some tasters were loyal, others were forced, and some weren't actually used at all, because how much can you trust a man who might be bribed? So kings developed habits, obsessive ones. Some refused to eat food prepared outside their chambers. Others rotated cooks constantly. Some carried their own water supply, ate from their own bowls, locked their goblets, kept a small pouch of trusted herbs to neutralize unknown ingredients. Often more superstition than science. And drinks. Even worse, wine was a favorite method of assassination. It masked bitterness. It traveled in barrels. It was served in ornate, identical cups. If a servant poured 2 goblets, one for you, one for your guest, how could you be sure which was which? Some kings demanded sealed bottles, opened only in front of them. Others swapped cups mid-toast. Some pretended to drink. A few simply drank less, knowing thirst was better than death. And you still weren't safe. Because poison didn't need to be in food. It could be on a knife handle, a letter seal, the lip of a goblet, the lining of your gloves, the ink on a scroll, the sweat of a traitor shaking your hand. That kind of danger got into your head. It made you suspicious of everyone. Every banquet became a test. Every servant, a suspect. Every stomach cramp, a possible sign. Even accidents were suspect. If a guest fell ill, was it an attempt on you that missed? Was someone sending a message? And don't think it only happened in enemy courts. Kings were poisoned by their own wives, sons, chancellors, and doctors. Because poison was discreet. It didn't leave a bloody trail. It didn't start a war. It solved a problem without making a scene. And when the king died, it could always be explained away. Fever, they'd say. A chill. Something he ate. The same people who arranged the death would write the records, and the body would be buried, along with the truth. This wasn't just rare, it was expected. Royal chroniclers often wrote about kings who were rumored to have been poisoned. Some were obvious. Others, we'll never know. But the point was clear. To be a king was to be watched, and to eat like a king was to dine in fear. So while you sat at your gilded table surrounded by gold plates and velvet banners, you weren't at ease. You were playing Russian roulette with every bite. Because in medieval politics, a dagger in the back was loud, but poison in the wine, that was civilized. Next, we'll explore just how deep the danger went. Because it wasn't just your wine or your family that could kill you, it was your entire court. Imagine waking up every day knowing someone wants you dead, and not just one person, but dozens. That was the reality of being a medieval king. Every conversation could be a lie. Every alliance could be a trap. Every loyal subject could be your assassin. Because once you had the crown, you weren't just a ruler, you were a target with a title. And you didn't wear that crown in solitude. You wore it in a hall filled with nobles, bishops, ambassadors, envoys, spies, and servants, all of whom had motives, allegiances, and knife-length attention spans. Let's talk about the nobles first. These weren't powerless peasants bowing to your every word. These were landed lords, war-hardened men with their own castles, armies, and treasuries. Some of them were older than you, some richer. Some thought they should be wearing the crown themselves, or that their son should be. They smiled in your court, bowed before your throne, kissed your ring, and then returned to their estates to plot your downfall. Because medieval kings relied on their nobles to govern, collect taxes, and enforce laws. But that gave the nobles power, too much. If a group of them decided they were done listening to you, they could form a rebellion overnight. Write a charter, raise banners, march on your capital. And sometimes they did. And if you thought your advisors were safer, think again. Your council wasn't a team, it was a snake pit in velvet robes. Each advisor had his own goals: economic, religious, territorial. They told you what you wanted to hear, while quietly working to get what they wanted. Some were bribed, some were threatened, some were so ambitious, they didn't even need a reason. You had to be careful with every word you spoke. A comment in jest could be twisted into policy. A moment of frustration could be interpreted as weakness. A compliment to one lord could enrage another. Court wasn't just politics, it was war in slow motion, fought with words, whispers, and alliances you couldn't always see. And then came the foreign agents. Ambassadors from rival kingdoms were welcomed as guests, but often acted as spies. They brought news, gifts, letters, and gathered every piece of gossip they could find. They listened at feasts, they bribed servants, they made deals with nobles who weren't quite loyal. They'd return home with reports. How weak you looked, which lords hated you, whether you could be bought, whether you could be toppled. And sometimes, the real plotters weren't even in court. They were in monasteries, bishoprics, and fortresses, coordinating rebellions, spreading rumors, or funding uprisings, all while pretending to pray for your health. The church, too, could be an enemy. If a bishop decided you were unfit, he could turn public opinion against you. If the Pope excommunicated you, your legitimacy vanished overnight. Even your friends would step back, because no one wants to stand too close to a king that God has rejected. And here's the worst part. Most of the time, you didn't know who to trust. Because betrayal didn't always come from the loudest critics. It came from the ones who were closest. The ones who said they loved you. The ones who served you for years. The ones who smiled a little too easily and waited just a little too long to kneel. You couldn't fire everyone. You couldn't exile every noble. You couldn't lead alone. So you played the game. Rewarding loyalty, punishing suspicion, balancing rivalries, hosting tournaments, making marriages, giving land, taking it back, watching everyone, trusting no one. Your court was a dance, and misstep meant death. Sometimes, literally. Assassinations weren't just rumors, they happened. Poisoned rings, staged accidents, disappearances, dagger-in-the-dark endings that got cleaned up before dawn. And if the plot didn't kill you, it might just replace you. Kings were deposed, overthrown, and usurped all the time. Some were locked in towers, some forced to abdicate, some dragged into battle against their own vassals. The terrifying truth. You could be king on Monday and a prisoner by Friday. So no, you didn't rule from a place of peace. You ruled from a throne surrounded by vipers. Every decision you made created enemies. Every alliance you forged alienated someone else. Every step forward risked opening another trapdoor. And still, the world expected you to smile, to look strong, to give inspiring speeches, throw lavish feasts, marry wisely, and father sons who wouldn't stab you in your sleep, because you were the king, which meant you were the one everyone wanted to either control or replace. Next, we'll see how being king also meant constant warfare, because even if your court didn't kill you, There was always someone outside your kingdom ready to march on your borders. If you were a medieval king and you weren't at war, you were about to be. Because in the Middle Ages, peace wasn't the norm. It was a pause between catastrophes. And being a king didn't mean ruling from the safety of a marble throne. It meant strapping on armor, raising armies, and marching into the blood-soaked unknown, again and again and again. Let's get one thing straight. War was expected of you. It proved strength. It maintained loyalty. It distracted the nobles. It kept the peasants too busy digging graves to think about rebellion. And if you didn't go to war, people started to wonder if you were too soft to wear the crown. Sometimes the war was external. Your neighbors, dukes, kings, rival claimants, they didn't need much of a reason. A border dispute, a broken marriage pact, a trade disagreement, a passing insult. Any of it could spark an invasion. And you'd better respond fast, because waiting made you look weak. And weak kings didn't last. Other times the war was internal. A rebellious noble, a cousin claiming a stronger bloodline, a regional uprising, a city refusing to pay taxes. These weren't small matters. They were civil wars in slow motion, and you couldn't ignore them, because every act of disobedience, if left unchecked, was a signal to the rest of the realm. The king has no teeth, so you raised an army. That meant coin, food, weapons, logistics, and most of all, people. Your army wasn't a professional, full-time fighting force. It was a mess of levied peasants, feudal knights, mercenaries, and conscripts, each with their own loyalty, training, and level of interest in not dying. They were disorganized. They were unreliable. They were expensive. And they were yours to command and to feed, house, move, and keep from stabbing each other. And don't forget, as king, you didn't stay home during war. You were expected to lead from the front, to ride into battle, to rally the troops, to charge with the vanguard, raise your sword, and bleed with your men. It wasn't optional. A king who didn't fight beside his army wasn't a king. He was a coward. And if you died in battle, great, you'd be remembered as a hero. But if you lived and lost, your crown was up for grabs. Even victories weren't easy. You'd win a siege, and then spend the next year rebuilding what your army just destroyed. You'd capture a city, and then have to hold it against revolt. You'd kill your rival, and create 3 more. And war didn't stop when the fighting ended. You had to manage ransom negotiations, prisoner exchanges, treaties, and grudges that never went away. Sometimes peace was just war on parchment. A fragile agreement that everyone knew would shatter the next time someone got ambitious. And the cost? Massive. Wars drained your treasury, ruined your lands, disrupted trade, and killed your subjects. You raised taxes to fund a campaign, and suddenly the peasants were starving and the nobles were furious. So you taxed the nobles instead, and now they were sharpening their swords. And what were you even fighting for? Sometimes it was honor. Sometimes it was a title. Sometimes it was a muddy patch of farmland on the edge of nowhere. But you had to fight, because kings who didn't fight lost everything. And even if you won the war, truly won, you didn't get peace. You got a kingdom on the verge of collapse. Broken roads, burned fields, homeless villagers, dying soldiers, angry priests, famine, plague, rumors, conspiracies, regret. But you couldn't stop, because the next war was already coming. You weren't a king. You were a permanent military commander. And even when your body broke, when your sword arm failed, your joints ached, your lungs wheezed, they still expected you to ride out, to wave the banner, to show strength. Because one moment of absence, one battle fought without you, and someone else might come back with your crown. Next, we'll look at the army you were expected to command, and how your soldiers weren't just unreliable, they might not even like you. You'd think a king could at least count on his army, right? They wore your colors. They fought under your banner. They chanted your name before battle. They were your shield, your sword, your strength. But here's the uncomfortable truth. In the Middle Ages, your army didn't love you. They didn't even really serve you. They served coin, custom, or fear. And often, they hated your guts while doing it. Let's break this down. First, there were the levies, peasants conscripted by their lords to fight. These men weren't soldiers, they were farmers, bakers, blacksmiths, pulled from their homes, handed rusty weapons, and told, "Die for your king." They didn't know your politics. They didn't care about your legacy. They just wanted to survive long enough to go home and plant crops. They didn't see you as a leader. They saw you as the reason they were sleeping in mud, starving between marches, and watching their friends bleed out on foreign soil. Then you had the feudal knights. These weren't full-time professionals either. They were landowners summoned by feudal obligation. They owed service to their lord, who owed it to you. Their loyalty was indirect at best, and most of them weren't interested in dying just to make your name look better in a chronicle. They'd show up to fulfill their duty, sure, but once their time was up, they'd ride home, with or without your permission. Now add in the mercenaries, hired swords, men who fought for pay and nothing else. They were useful, brutal, and often the most skilled on the field. But their loyalty lasted exactly as long as your money did. If your treasury ran dry, they might leave. Or worse, switch sides. Some mercenary bands in the Middle Ages were so infamous that kings used them and feared them in equal measure. Because when they weren't getting paid, they became roving bandits, armed, angry, and already inside your kingdom. And then there's the sheer lack of control you had over your own army. Command wasn't streamlined. There was no standardized training, no central doctrine. Communication was slow, confusing, and often lost entirely in the heat of battle. Half the army might be loyal to one noble, the other half to another, both fighting for you, but also secretly hating each other. So what happened when morale broke? Desertion, mutiny, disobedience, looting, chaos. Troops disobeyed orders. Entire units walked off the field. They pillaged villages, yours, not the enemy's. They killed each other over rations or gambling debts. They attacked civilians, stole from churches, started fires, and blamed it all on the fog of war. And who got the blame? You, the king. Because when the army committed atrocities, it was your face that the world saw. When soldiers refused to fight, it was your leadership they questioned. When you lost a battle, it wasn't your generals who were called weak, it was you. Even your own commanders weren't guaranteed to be loyal. Some were noble-born and resented you for being younger, richer, or not of pure enough blood. Others had alliances of their own, whispering behind tents, measuring your success like merchants watching the value of grain. In some cases, your own men tried to replace you mid-campaign, spread rumors, withhold orders, undermine morale, suggest that maybe they'd be better off with a different king, a stronger one, a braver one. And you were supposed to smile through it, ride out in shining armor, wave the banner, act like everything was fine, even as you wondered if the men behind you would follow your command or put a sword through your back. It wasn't just about fear, it was about detachment. You were a man in a golden crown, surrounded by people in dirty boots. You slept in a tent with cushions. They slept in filth. You ate roast duck. They chewed on moldy bread. You had doctors. They had leeches and hope. No matter how much you fought beside them, they saw you as separate, and separation breeds resentment, especially when they were dying for decisions made in castles they'd never see. So no, your army wasn't a brotherhood. It was a powder keg. You were the match. And if the battle went badly, if your command wavered, your face flinched or your horse ran, they would turn on you. Maybe not on the field, but soon enough, because loyalty in medieval warfare was a rented thing, and when the rent came due, you might not be able to pay it. Next, we'll see what happened when you did try to raise money, and how taxing your kingdom could be. The thing that broke it. War costs money. So does peace. And if you're a medieval king, it's your problem to pay for both. The problem? You don't really have any money. Despite what the crown robe and gold-threaded banner might suggest, medieval monarchs were rarely sitting on mountains of wealth. In fact, most of them were perpetually broke, juggling debts, chasing coin, and scraping together funds like over-glorified accountants with swords. And where did kings get their money? They took it from the people, from the nobles, from the church, if they dared. That meant taxation, and taxation, in the medieval world, was one of the fastest ways to go from God's anointed to enemy of the people. Here's how it worked, or rather didn't. There was no centralized revenue office, no streamlined tax code, no neat forms and online payments. Instead, tax collection was a chaotic web of local officials, royal agents, feudal lords, and churchmen, all trying to collect their share and pocketing as much as they could on the way. When a king needed cash, he would issue a royal decree, a tollage, a scutage, a levy, a customs duty, or just an extraordinary aid. The terminology varied, but the message was the same. Pay up. Sometimes it was based on land, sometimes on trade, sometimes just on the fact that the king said so, and the people hated it. For peasants, taxes meant grain taken from hungry mouths. For merchants, it meant profits slashed. For nobles, it meant losing control over their own wealth, and they hated that. And so, taxing the wrong group, or taxing at the wrong time, could spark everything from riots to open rebellion. It happened more than once. Raise taxes to fund a war, the barons demand concessions. Raise them again, towns shut their gates. Raise them one more time, and suddenly someone's calling a council to reconsider your right to rule. And it didn't help that you couldn't tax the church, at least not easily. The church owned land, lots of it. They had wealth, tithes, offerings, rent, but they were protected. Try to tax a bishop, and you risked excommunication, which was basically the medieval equivalent of being erased from the political map. So you turned to the people you thought you could tax, and discovered very quickly that every coin you tried to collect lost you a supporter. Nobles demanded favors in exchange. Clergy pleaded immunity. Towns asked for charters, privileges, or exemptions. And peasants? They just fled. Whole villages would empty out to avoid taxation. Fields left unplanted. Tools abandoned. Because death by starvation was slow, but death by tax collector could be sudden and violent. And remember, kings didn't collect taxes themselves. They sent agents, and those agents weren't subtle. They were corrupt. They were brutal. They overcharged, threatened, and extorted. And when the people revolted, who did they blame? You. You were the one who sent them. You were the one who issued the order. You were the one whose banner they flew. And when the mob finally boiled over, it wasn't the tax collector they came for. It was the castle, the throne, the crown. Even when tax collection worked, the money barely lasted. Campaigns were expensive, so were building projects. Bribes, ransoms, ceremonies, diplomacy, clothing, food, wages, dowries. So you taxed again and again, until the very people who once supported you began questioning whether you were even worth having. There are entire revolts that started over taxation, peasant uprisings, urban riots, even noble conspiracies, because nothing reminded people that the king was just another man demanding their money, quite like a surprise tax demand in the middle of a famine. And if you tried to cut costs instead, that meant reducing someone's pension, cancelling someone's project, delaying someone's payment, which meant making enemies in every direction. No matter what you did, someone suffered. And in the Middle Ages, suffering people didn't write angry letters. They picked up pitchforks. So you learned to tax carefully, to lie, to hide expenses, to juggle debts, to balance your treasury like you were defusing a bomb. Because the second it exploded, you weren't a king anymore. You were a man in a crown, about to be overthrown. Next, we'll look at one group you especially had to tread carefully around, the only power that could rival your throne, the church. You might have worn a golden crown and ruled by divine right. But in the Middle Ages, there was one power even you couldn't touch, the church. Because while you were king of your kingdom, the church was king of every soul within it, including yours. On paper, you and the church were supposed to work together. You ruled the body, they ruled the spirit. You defended the realm, they guided the flock. Two pillars of society, partners in divine order. In reality, it was a cold war in robes and armor, a struggle for control, legitimacy, and survival. Let's be clear, the church wasn't just a religious institution. It was a global power network. It owned land, a lot of it. It collected taxes, tithes, often more efficiently than you did. It had its own courts, its own laws, its own diplomats, and in many places, its own armies. The Pope wasn't just the Bishop of Rome. He was a king of kings, a man who could make or break rulers with a single decree. And if you crossed him, he could unleash the most devastating punishment of all, excommunication. That wasn't just a personal curse, it was political annihilation. Being excommunicated meant your people weren't allowed to obey you. Your allies couldn't support you. Your court turned on you. Your enemies were invited to attack you. With the Pope's blessing, it meant no sacraments, no last rites, no burial in holy ground. You weren't just a bad king, you were outside the body of Christ. And if your kingdom depended on religious legitimacy, and it did, that was the beginning of the end. Some kings tried to push back. They taxed the church, appointed their own bishops, interfered in papal elections, fought over land, law, and control of cathedrals. And in return, the church fought back, with curses, with propaganda, with revolts stirred from pulpits, with rival claimants to your throne, sometimes even with holy war. One example, Henry I of the Holy Roman Empire. He dared to challenge the Pope's authority to appoint bishops. He ended up excommunicated, stripped of support, and forced to beg barefoot in the snow for forgiveness. That was the power of the church. It could reduce an emperor to a penitent. It could turn your people against you without drawing a sword. It could rewrite your legacy, labeling you a tyrant or a heretic for future generations to spit on. And the worst part, you couldn't truly fight back. You couldn't execute a bishop without scandal. You couldn't raid a monastery without backlash. You couldn't seize church land without causing a crisis. Even when the church was corrupt, and it often was, you were still expected to submit. Because if you didn't, they'd claim you weren't just a bad king, you were an enemy of God. So you played a game of shadows. You bribed bishops. You stacked cathedral chapters. You placed loyal priests in key positions. You negotiated, threatened, flattered, and begged. And still, you walked a knife's edge every single day. Because religion wasn't optional. It was everywhere. It shaped how your people saw you, how your nobles judged you, how history remembered you. If you ruled well but died excommunicated, you were damned. If you ruled terribly but gave to the church, you might be sainted. And if a pope decided to remove you, he didn't need an army. He just needed a pen. So, no, being king didn't mean you were the highest power in the land. It meant you were negotiating with a rival throne, one not made of gold, but of doctrine, incense, and centuries of fear. Next, we'll step into the royal marriage bed and see how even your queen could be your greatest liability. They called it a royal marriage. But for a medieval king, it was often more like a high-stakes hostage situation in a velvet dress. Because your queen, your lawful, noble, politically advantageous wife, wasn't just there for ceremony. She was watching, listening, waiting, and sometimes plotting. Let's start at the beginning. You didn't choose her, not really. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were alliances, strategic partnerships, calculated gambles played across kingdoms and continents. You married the daughter of a duke, or an emperor, or a rival king. Maybe she brought troops, maybe she brought land, maybe she brought peace. What she didn't bring was loyalty, at least not automatically, because her heart didn't belong to you. It belonged to her family, to her country, to her ambitions. If things went south between your kingdom and hers, whose side would she take? And even when the politics were stable, your marriage might not be. Some queens were obedient, some were silent, but many were sharp, educated, and politically savvy, trained to navigate court life from birth. They knew how to gather influence, how to whisper suggestions, how to build networks of allies behind the scenes. In some courts, the queen's apartments buzzed louder than your own council chambers. She had ladies in waiting. She had servants. She had correspondence, letters sent and received across borders, often without your permission. She was the social center of the court, the silent ear behind every scandal, the one person who could make or break a noble's standing without ever raising her voice. And you had to sleep beside her every night. If your queen loved you, that was a gift. But if she didn't, she could become your most dangerous enemy. She could undermine your authority, leak secrets, manipulate succession, shield traitors, or even help poison you, and not just figuratively. Plenty of kings throughout history were undone by queens who had ambition and patience in equal measure. Some queens coordinated with rival factions. Some smuggled messages to invading armies. Some helped plot coups with their own sons. And speaking of sons, succession was everything. The queen's most important job, in the eyes of the realm, was to produce a legitimate male heir. And if she couldn't, the pressure was immense. You were expected to divorce, remarry, or worse, accuse her of adultery or witchcraft, just to clear the path for a new wife. And if she did produce sons, now the game changed, because she wasn't just a wife, she was now the queen mother, and her job became ensuring her son, not one of your bastards or nephews, inherited the throne. And that meant making enemies, pushing agenda, shielding her child, even if it meant undermining you. There were entire reigns defined by queenly power struggles. Some queens ruled in all but name. Others launched civil wars to protect their children from your other children. And if you died before your heir came of age, guess who took control as regent? She did. Suddenly, the woman you once tried to keep out of politics was running the entire kingdom, and if she blamed you for how things turned out, your memory wasn't going to be treated kindly. And let's not pretend marriage kept your heart in check. Most kings had mistresses, lovers, entire broods of illegitimate children, but that wasn't free of consequences. Every affair risks scandal, jealousy, factionalism, and worst of all, comparison. If your mistress was more charming than your queen, that was a problem. If your illegitimate son looked like a better heir than your legitimate one, that was a crisis. The queen would hear everything, every rumor, every late-night visit, every whisper. She kept records, she made alliances, she waited, because even if you ruled the court, she ruled the rooms you weren't watching. And she knew better than anyone. The king's power ends where the bedchamber door closes. Next, we'll look at the most dangerous piece on the royal board, your own children, the ones who would inherit your crown or take it from you early. You hoped your children would be your legacy, that they'd carry your name with pride, protect your kingdom, secure your bloodline. But if you were a medieval king, your children weren't just heirs. They were tools, they were targets, and sometimes they were your undoing. From the moment they were born, royal children were no longer yours. They were assets, bargaining chips in a violent game of diplomacy, succession, and survival. Let's start with the sons. Your firstborn was supposed to be your heir, the one who carried your name, inherited your throne, and continued your glory. But getting him to the crown wasn't easy. First, you had to keep him alive. Infant mortality in the Middle Ages was brutal. Fevers, infections, accidents, and sometimes murder. He could be poisoned by rivals, kidnapped during a rebellion, or quietly disappear during a succession crisis, assuming he lived. Now you had a new problem, keeping him loyal, because heirs grew impatient, especially when their fathers clung to power. They were raised with tutors, swords, and praise, told they were destined for greatness, watched from the shadows as you made decisions, and thought, I could do better. Many princes didn't wait to inherit. They rebelled, raised armies, challenged their fathers openly. Some were crowned by rival factions while their fathers were still alive. You had to choose. Crush your own child, negotiate with him, imprison him, or let him take the throne early and pray he didn't return the favor one day. And what about your other sons? They didn't inherit, so they became problems. Some were shipped off to monasteries. Some were given land and turned into regional warlords. Some joined rival courts, married into dangerous families, or sold themselves to foreign powers who wanted your kingdom weakened from the inside. Even if they stayed loyal, their existence alone invited conspiracy, because every noble with a grudge knew this simple truth. A second son is still a son, and sometimes he's more useful than the heir. Now let's talk about daughters. In medieval politics, royal daughters were weapons with wedding dresses. You married them off to secure alliances, to stop wars, to create peace between houses that had been killing each other for generations. Once they were gone, they didn't stop being political tools. They carried secrets. They bore children with your enemy's blood. They whispered in their new husband's ears, and sometimes they whispered your name. If a war broke out, whose side would they take? Your daughter's loyalty was always uncertain, because her husband's loyalty took precedence. And what about the grandchildren? Mixed blood, conflicting claims, foreign names. Some kings were overthrown by their own grandchildren, raised abroad, trained to see you as the tyrant standing in their way. Even your bastards weren't safe. Sometimes they were loyal. Sometimes they were charismatic, popular, and just legitimate enough to cause trouble. People rallied behind them. Nobles used them as puppets. Some kings were dethroned by their own illegitimate sons, the ones who were never meant to matter. And all of this happened while you were still trying to rule. You couldn't be a father. Not really. You had to be a strategist, a keeper, a warden. You had to watch your children grow, and then wonder, will this one save me or destroy me? You assigned them tutored, oversaw their training, chose their marriages, built alliances around their lives, and watched helplessly as they grew into people with minds, ambitions, and loyalties of their own. Even if they loved you, that love was never enough. Because ambition doesn't wait, power doesn't pause for bedtime stories, and history doesn't remember you as a good dad. It remembers whether your children took your throne in glory or ripped it from your cold, unburied hands. Next, we'll talk about the royal bloodline itself, and why the genes passed down through centuries of intermarriage didn't just threaten your legacy. They threatened your mind. In the Middle Ages, kings were expected to be many things: strong, wise, pious, commanding. But more than anything else, they were expected to be stable. A king's mind was supposed to be as solid as his fortress. But what if the cracks were already there, in the blood? Because when you trace the family trees of medieval royalty, you don't find branches, you find knots. Sacred, kept pure through intermarriage, which meant your mother might have been your cousin, your grandfather might have been your uncle, your children's family tree might have been more like a loop. This wasn't rare, it was standard. And with that purity came a price. Hereditary madness. Now, of course, medieval people didn't understand genetics. They didn't know what schizophrenia was. They didn't have terms for bipolar disorder, dementia, depression, or epilepsy. But they saw what happened, and they feared it. Because when a king lost his grip on reality, the entire kingdom shook. Some went slowly, withdrawing from court life, hearing voices, seeing ghosts. Others broke suddenly, screaming in council meetings, staring at wall, smearing feces on palace floor. Some became paranoid, convinced their closest advisors were plotting treason, convinced their wives were witches, convinced their food was poisoned, sometimes true, often not. Others turned violent, ordering executions at random, killing messengers for bringing bad news, murdering servants for looking wrong. And all the while, their court tried to pretend nothing was happening. Because to admit the king was mad was to admit the kingdom was leaderless, and that was an open invitation to civil war. So instead, they whispered, they covered for him, they forged his signature. They gave polite names to terrifying behavior, ill humors, divine visions, holy melancholy. Some kings were locked away. Some were propped up like puppets. Some were forced to abdicate, but not all went quietly. And some stayed in power while their kingdoms burned around them. Let's talk specifics. Charles VI of France. They called him Charles the Mad. He believed he was made of glass, refused to be touched, forgot who he was, ordered men executed, then wept over their deaths hours later. He ruled for decades. Joanna of Castile, called Joanna the Mad. She allegedly carried her husband's corpse with her, slept beside it, refused to bury it. Was she grieving or lost in delusion? No one cared. She was locked away for life. And they weren't alone, because madness ran through royal bloodlines like rot through wood. And there was no cure, no therapy, just superstition, prayer, or trepanation, drilling a hole in your skull to let the demons out. And if you were a king, and you knew madness ran in your line, that was its own kind of torment. Every bad mood became a warning sign. Every moment of grief felt like a spiral. You watched your father lose his mind and wondered if you were next. You feared sleep, feared dreams, feared mirrors, feared silence because silence made the thoughts louder. And if you did start to break, there was nowhere to go. You couldn't rest. You couldn't withdraw. You couldn't get help, because kings couldn't be sick, kings couldn't be weak. Kings had to be immortal ideas wearing human flesh. But you weren't. You were just a man. A man with headache, with pressure, with pain that wouldn't go away, and blood full of ghosts. Next we'll see how even the people you trusted most, your advisors, your bodyguards, your companions, weren't always there to help. Sometimes, they were just waiting for the right moment to strike. In stories, a king is surrounded by loyal men, brave knights, wise advisors, faithful guards. But in real medieval life, being king meant standing at the center of a court full of masks. Because the deeper you got into power, the clearer one thing became. No one around you was there out of love. They were there for access, for influence, for survival. And when it came down to it, they'd throw you to the wolves in a heartbeat. Let's start with your council. These were the men closest to your rule, your chancellor, your treasurer, your spymaster, your chamberlain. They advised you. They carried your words. They shaped your laws. But they weren't saints. They were politicians, and politicians lie. Some had their own agendas. Some were working for rival nobles. Some had been planted in your court years ago, waiting to steer your reign in a direction someone else wanted. They'd nod in meetings, agree with you in public, and then, behind closed doors, they'd reword your orders, misplace your messages, delay your reforms. They controlled your flow of information, what you heard, when you heard it, if you heard it. A king might think he rules the realm, but if the men around him control the ink and the messengers, they control the truth. Then there were your bodyguards, supposed to be your protectors, your personal shield wall, hand-picked men sworn to defend your life with their own. But they were human too. Some were bought, bribed with land or gold, to look the other way. Others were threatened, families held hostage until the blade went in your back. A few were simply ambitious, tired of guarding the throne and ready to take it. Many kings were killed by their own protectors. Not in battle, not on campaign, but in the safety of their own palace, in bed, at prayer, during a quiet walk in the garden. Then came the chamberlains, pages, and servants. The ones who dressed you, fed you, heard your private words, saw you weep, saw you bleeding, knew the details that could destroy you. You couldn't watch them all, couldn't vet them all, and all it took was one servant with a grudge, or a bribe, to open the wrong door at the wrong time. And still you had to act like you trusted them, because nothing eroded power faster than paranoia. You had to laugh with them, dine with them, take counsel, give rewards, maintain the illusion of unity, while knowing full well that the dagger might already be in motion. And it wasn't just individuals. It was faction. Your court was divided. Old blood versus new money. Local nobles versus foreign interests. Religious hardliners versus secular reformers. Every policy you passed angered one side. Every favor you granted fueled resentment on another. So they watched, they schemed, they built alliances within your own palace. And the moment you looked vulnerable, they moved. Sometimes it started as whispers. Sometimes as resignations. Sometimes as a friendly suggestion that maybe it was time to step down. And you smiled through it, because you had no idea who was still on your side, or if anyone was. Even your friends were suspect. Because what is friendship in a court built on ambition? The men you grew up with? They wanted land. They wanted titles. They wanted you to owe them, not the other way around. And if they saw you slipping, they wouldn't fall with you. They'd push. So you isolated. You stopped sharing secrets. You stopped trusting praise. You questioned every gesture, every compliment, every well-timed gift. You looked into a room full of familiar faces and saw threats wearing smiles. Because when you're king, betrayal doesn't come with warning. It doesn't wear black. It doesn't shout. It bows. Next, we'll look at how all this fear, all this pressure, all this endless performance leads to the ultimate trap. How the very throne you fought to keep becomes the cage you can't escape. Everyone sees the throne as the highest seat in the land, a symbol of command, control, destiny fulfilled. But for medieval kings, the throne wasn't a pedestal. It was a prison disguised as a chair. From the moment you sat on it, you weren't just ruler of a kingdom. You became its prisoner. You belonged to the realm, to tradition, to expectation, and every single day of your reign was spent playing a part you weren't allowed to step out of. Let's start with the basics. A king didn't own his time. He was locked into a daily schedule dictated by protocol and presence. You rose when your attendance allowed you to. You dressed not for comfort, but for optics. Thick robes, fine embroidery, the right colors for the day's rituals. Even your boots and rings had political meaning. Nothing you wore was simple. Everything was a statement. You weren't free to speak casually. Every word was weighed. Every offhand comment could be repeated to nobles, to rivals, to foreign courts. Your voice had the weight of law, even when you didn't mean it to. So you learned to smile when you wanted to scream, to nod when you wanted to disagree, to pretend you were in command when you hadn't slept in 3 days, and your stomach was twisted in knots from stress and distrust. And make no mistake, everyone was watching. The court was a theater. Every move you made was observed, noted, and interpreted. Did you look tired during the meeting? Weak? Did you frown during the bishop's sermon? Blasphemous? Did you hesitate before answering the ambassador? Insecure? You weren't just judged by your enemies. Your allies were watching too, because if the ship started sinking, they needed to know when to jump. Even walking was political. You couldn't limp. You couldn't slouch. You couldn't appear injured, even if you were bleeding under your robes. Because the king didn't suffer. Not publicly. That was the rule. And when it came to solitude, forget it. You were never alone. Your meals were supervised. Your sleep was guarded. Even your prayers might be observed, especially during high holy days. You couldn't take a walk without someone trailing 10 steps behind. Privacy was for peasants. The king was property. And then there were the ceremonies, coronations, feasts, tours, parades. You had to show your face, even when your soul was collapsing. A family member died? You mourned for exactly the correct number of days. A famine struck the land. You smiled at banquets, while pretending the roast venison didn't taste like guilt. Your son betrayed you. You toasted to unity with a goblet that shook slightly in your hand. You were expected to be a god, a judge, a general, and a priest, all in one. But inside, you were a man trapped in a crown that didn't allow mistakes. Now add to that the geography of the throne. You couldn't just get away for a few days. A king didn't vacation. Even your hunting trips came with entourages, rituals, planned appearances, and any time you left the capital, the entire apparatus of power followed. Nobles, cooks, guards, secretaries, horses, carts, holy relics, ledgers. Your whole world dragged across the countryside like a traveling fortress. You weren't exploring. You were relocating the prison, and inside it, your enemies multiplied. The longer you ruled, the more mistakes you made, the more taxes you levied, the more rivals you punished, the more heirs you offended. You couldn't escape your past because it kept knocking at your door in the form of resentment and revenge. Even your own household staff, the people you saw every day, could become spies, and you couldn't even dismiss them without sparking gossip. Why did he remove the steward? What did the cook overhear? Has the king grown unstable, and every rumor chipped away at your legitimacy? So you started to doubt yourself. You became cautious, then secretive, then cold, and all the while, the public still demanded strength, wisdom, benevolence, vision, even when you were falling apart under the pressure. And if you tried to change, to reform things, to modernize laws, to shift power dynamics, you hit walls, made of tradition, made of religion, made of nobles with bloodlines older than yours, who saw your innovation as heresy. So you stayed in the cage, adjusted the cushions, painted the bars gold, and told yourself that was enough. But it wasn't, because as the years passed, you realized something even more terrifying than the throne's restrictions. You built it. You made the rules that now bind you. You enforced the roles that now trap you. You demanded the rituals that now exhaust you. And when it's finally time to leave it behind, you can't. There's no retirement for kings. There's no abdication without backlash. There's no quiet death in the countryside. Only rebellion, or a fall, or the slow, painful disintegration of your mind and body until the throne passes to someone younger, someone who doesn't yet realize what it costs to sit where you sit. So no, the throne wasn't glory. It wasn't power. It wasn't a reward. It was a seat with no exit, a gilded trap. A role that consumed the actor until there was nothing left but robes, rumors, and a name scratched into history by people who never truly knew how hard it was to play the king. When people think of what a king might want, they imagine peace, peaceful borders, peaceful nobles, peaceful peasants working the fields, paying their taxes, and praising your name. But for a medieval king, peace wasn't peace. It was a breeding ground for threats you couldn't see coming. And very often, it was more dangerous than war. War, for all its chaos, had clarity. You knew who the enemy was. You knew what needed to be done. You had men in armor, a goal to pursue, a battle to win. It was horrible, yes, but at least it was simple. When the swords were out, you didn't have to wonder who hated you. Peace, though? Peace was silence filled with teeth. It began with your nobles. During war, they were busy fighting for you, or at least pretending to. They rode out, managed troops, burned enemy villages, and died in places far from court. You could count on their temporary loyalty because they had a role, a purpose, a job. But when the war ended, they came home. Back to their castles, back to their lands, back to court, and back to ambition. Without a battlefield to prove themselves, they looked for other ways to gain favor, power, territory, and they started remembering every insult, every slight, every tax demand, every younger cousin they thought should be king instead of you. They had time. They had money, and now they had nothing better to do than plot. Some of them started gathering informants. Others hosted lavish feasts to rally support. Some wrote letters to your enemies. A few quietly built private armies for security. They weren't carrying banners yet, but they were choosing sides. Meanwhile, your court bloated. During campaigns, your inner circle was tight. Military commanders, trusted advisors, battle-hardened men, but in peace, courtiers flooded in, flatterers, climbers, gossipers. They came for favors, titles, land grants, and status, and they'd do anything to get them. They spread rumors like wildfire. About your health, about your heir, about your queen. They tried to discredit your allies. They plotted to remove ministers. They turned your throne room into a theater of masks, where loyalty was just another costume. And all the while, you were expected to be gracious, to entertain, to hold court with dignity, to pretend that the knives under every smile didn't worry you. But the danger didn't stop at home. It came from across the sea, across borders, across pulpits and trade caravans. Because foreign powers noticed your peace too. While you were repairing your roads and rebuilding your granaries, they were probing your weaknesses, sending diplomats who doubled as spies, offering marriages that would tie your bloodline to theirs, and possibly poison it, funding rebels in your borderlands, disputing old treaties, calling in debts from long-forgotten agreements. They weren't fighting you with swords. They were using diplomacy, commerce, religion, and your own reputation. And let's not forget the church. During war, they'd bless your banners and pray for victory. But peace gave the church room to breathe and to expand. They started asserting more power over law, education, morality, claiming jurisdiction over disputes you thought were yours, insisting on tax exemptions, land grants, and political favors, challenging your authority in court, sometimes literally in the courtroom. And if you resisted, you risked excommunication, which meant your power, your right to rule, even your soul, was suddenly in question. But the most dangerous thing about peace, it gave people time to think. The peasants, for example, during war, they kept their heads down. They farmed, fed your army, and hoped no one burned their village. But during peace, they started asking questions. Why are taxes still high? Why are the roads still broken? Why did the king get richer while their stomachs stayed empty? They heard songs. They listened to preachers. They talked around fires at night. And unrest began to fester. Add to that your own family, especially your heirs. Your sons, who once obeyed you in battle, now began to see you as old, outdated, and vulnerable. They wanted roles, influence, titles, maybe even the throne. Now, they began to court the nobles themselves, befriend the very men who once swore loyalty to you, claim they could do things differently. They smiled at your table, and then whispered against you in your halls. Even your daughters could be used against you. Once married abroad, they became ambassadors of your bloodline, and if your policies displeased their new families, they might become tools of pressure or even war. And through it all, you were expected to look calm, to rule justly, to enjoy the peace you had earned. But you didn't rest. You couldn't, because peace wasn't safety. It was the part of the play where the villain steps out from behind the curtain. It was a knife left out in the open, a silence that grew louder with every passing week, a smile that said, soon. So no, peace wasn't your reward. It was your next battle. Only this one didn't come with banners or marches. It came with whispers, letters, silk-lined betrayals, and a slow unraveling of everything you'd built. Next, we'll enter the courtroom, where kings were expected to judge fairly, enforce justice, and protect the innocent. Or at least, pretend they were. Being king came with many titles: defender of the realm, keeper of the peace, fountain of justice. These grand-sounding roles suggested fairness, wisdom, and the protection of the common people. But in reality, the medieval justice system, the one you were meant to embody, was riddled with corruption, contradiction, and political landmines. And whether you tried to fix it or simply let it function as it was, one truth remained unavoidable. Justice was a performance, and as king you were both lead actor and scapegoat. In theory, you were the supreme judge of the land. The crown's authority flowed downward into courts, lords, bailiffs, and constables, all of whom claimed their legitimacy through you. But that power wasn't stable. You could rule on high-profile cases or overturn verdicts, but every decision you made risked offending someone, often someone powerful, someone necessary, someone already on the verge of rebellion. Sometimes you held public sessions of court, dramatic affairs where commoners would line up for a chance to plead their case before the king himself. It was a show of justice, meant to remind the people that you listened. But the truth was, you didn't know most of these people, and you rarely had the time or evidence to make a fair ruling. A farmer accused his neighbor of stealing oxen. The neighbor claimed innocence. A woman said her land was taken. A noble insisted it was properly seized. You were meant to sort through decades of feuds, local rivalries, and legal trickery, all in the span of a few minutes, with no neutral evidence, and no assurance anyone was telling the truth. Even when you didn't preside personally, the justice system still bore your name. Royal courts issued judgments with your seal. Criminal sentences were carried out in the king's peace. But you had little control over how fairly those courts operated. Local lords often acted as judges in their own territories, delivering verdicts based not on the law, but on their own interests. Punishments varied wildly, often depending less on the crime and more on the status of the accused. A peasant caught stealing a loaf of bread might be hanged. A noble who plotted treason might be politely exiled, or forgiven entirely if his allies were too dangerous to confront. Even worse, the church had its own courts. Priests, monks, and anyone who could claim benefit of clergy were often judged separately and more leniently, no matter the crime. You might want to punish a corrupt bishop or bring a violent abbot to justice, but if the church resisted, you could find yourself facing not just a legal dispute, but a theological crisis. And if you pushed too hard, the Pope could step in, excommunicate your ministers, or turn the people against you with accusations of sacrilege. Corruption was everywhere. Officials skimmed bribes, jurors were intimidated or handpicked by local elites. Witnesses could be paid off or silenced. Trials were often held in secret, with no transcripts, and verdicts could shift overnight depending on who visited the judge. The court system, meant to uphold the rule of law, became a marketplace where verdicts were bought, threats were traded, and true justice was a rarity. You knew this. Everyone did. But fixing it? That was dangerous. Any attempt to reform the system meant challenging entrenched powers, nobles who didn't want their autonomy questioned, churchmen who didn't want to answer to the crown, and ministers who profited off the chaos. And when you tried to impose standard laws or stricter enforcement, those same factions cried tyranny. The king is interfering. He's centralizing power. He's violating ancient custom. You could be hated for trying to fix things, and equally hated for leaving them broken. And yet, the people still came. They came to your court, wrote you petitions, waited hours just to kneel and beg for judgment. Some had been robbed, others beaten. Some had lost land, livelihoods, or family to unjust verdicts. They believed in justice, or at least in your ability to deliver it. And half the time you couldn't. Not because you didn't want to, but because doing so would have meant starting wars you couldn't win, legal, political, or literal. Over time, that helplessness hardened. You saw good people ruined. You saw guilty men walk free. You issued pardons because you had to, not because it was right. You watched courts become weapons, and your name stamped onto judgments that made your stomach turn. But you signed them anyway, because to stop signing would be to unravel the fragile web of power that held the kingdom together. Justice was never blind. It squinted, it bargained, it bowed to influence. And eventually, the people stopped believing in it altogether. They still feared the law, but they didn't trust it. And when things went wrong, when a mob rioted, when a noble executed someone without cause, when a priest abused his position, the blame didn't fall on the corrupt system. It fell on you, the king, because you were the one meant to uphold it all. And when you didn't, or couldn't, they saw weakness, not just in the laws, but in the crown itself. So no, justice wasn't your triumph. It wasn't the legacy the scribes promised. It was one more broken promise, dressed in royal robes. And you wore it, whether you wanted to or not. Next, we descend into the king's darkest hours, the nights behind closed doors, where sleep was a battlefield, and fear never stayed outside the bedchamber. For all the power, all the wealth, all the rituals designed to insulate you from fear, the one thing a medieval king could never count on was rest. You might sleep in a vast bed, under tapestries, embroidered with scenes of triumph. You might be surrounded by guards, your windows barred, your doors bolted, your bedchamber sealed tight behind heavy wood and iron. But none of it mattered, because when night fell and the court finally quieted, you were left with only your thoughts, and in the silence, they screamed louder than any army. Sleep wasn't peace, it was vulnerability. No matter how many guards stood outside your door, you always had to wonder, who paid them? Who were they loyal to? Were they truly there to protect you, or were they simply waiting for the right night to let someone else in? Plenty of kings had been killed in their own chambers, smothered, stabbed, strangled. It didn't take a battle, it didn't take a coup. All it took was one guard who had a change of heart. One cupbearer with a handful of powdered lead, one chamberlain with a quiet grudge, even a trusted servant, someone who knew when you slept, what you drank, how you snored, could be bribed, coerced, or convinced. So you laid in bed each night, trying to convince yourself that you were safe, that the guards were loyal, that your doors would stay shut, that the cough you heard in the hall wasn't a signal, that the shadow at the corner of your vision was just the curtain, just a candle flicker, just your imagination. And even if no one tried to kill you, the fear was enough. You lived in a world of betrayals and shifting alliances. Today's loyal noble could be tomorrow's usurper. Today's obedient son could be writing to your enemies. Even your own wife could be part of it. She knew your habits after all. She knew when you were most vulnerable. So sleep became fragmented. You stayed up too late, reading reports by candlelight, walking the halls when you should have been resting, haunted by faces you couldn't trust and decisions you couldn't undo. You slept in fits, waking at every sound, footsteps in the corridor, a door creaking open, voices too low to identify. Some kings kept daggers under their pillows. Others demanded that a guard sleep inside their room, just a few feet away. Some moved their sleeping quarters regularly, so no one could be sure where they were at night. A few even built hidden rooms, sealed chambers, passageways that only they knew about. But even those precautions didn't help with the other kind of unrest, the kind that came from memory. You saw the faces of men you'd condemned, heard the screams of the battlefield, remembered the words of your advisors warning you not to trust the people who sat at your table that very evening. You questioned every decision, the treaty you signed, the rebellion you crushed, the judgment you handed down earlier that day. Was it the right call? did it create a new enemy. Every mistake lingered, every death you ordered came back to you, and you wondered how many others were plotting the same for you in return. Your body paid the price. Medieval medicine was primitive, and stress, though not yet fully understood, took a toll. Ulcers, insomnia, muscle pain, exhaustion, and you couldn't show it. Not to your court, not to your family, not to your enemies. A tired king was a weak king. A weak king was one step away from losing everything, so even rest became a performance. You hosted banquets while stifling yawns. You rode in parades with your joints aching from sleepless nights. You sat in judgment while your eyes stung from the torches that kept you company at 3 a.m. And if your mind began to slip from fear, fatigue, or the slow erosion of sanity, no one told you. They smiled, flattered you, nodded at your rants, then whispered behind your back. They waited. Because they knew what you didn't want to admit. A king who can't sleep is a king who can't rule. And still the expectations didn't ease. You were supposed to be calm, wise, decisive. Every morning you rose and dressed, and spoke, and ruled as if you hadn't been lying awake for hours, listening for assassins, replaying old wars, questioning who you could still trust. And the worst part? You had no escape. Not in your chamber, not in your court, not in your mind. The throne followed you everywhere, even into your dreams. And when those dreams turned dark, as they often did, you woke gasping in silk sheets, surrounded by shadows and silence, and reminded yourself, once again, you were the most powerful man in the kingdom, and you were never safe. Next, we'll take a closer look at how that vulnerability went beyond assassins and paranoia, because even with all the money and medicine the kingdom could offer, disease didn't care if you wore a crown. For all the grandeur of the medieval crown, the gold, the velvet, the banners raised in your honor, nothing could protect you from the simplest and most merciless reality of the era. You could still die from a sneeze. Disease didn't recognize authority. It didn't care about your lineage, your wealth, or how many guards stood outside your door. You could build walls 50 feet high and still fall victim to an infection carried on the breath of a servant. You could fill your halls with incense and holy relics, and still rot away slowly from something as basic as an infected tooth. Being king might have elevated you above the masses in terms of power, but biologically you were no different, and often more exposed. Your daily life was crowded and highly social. You were constantly surrounded by people, courtiers, advisors, pages, cooks, ambassadors, all of them brushing past one another, touching objects, spreading disease, without ever knowing it. No one understood germ theory. No one boiled water before drinking. Rats ran under banquet tables. Chamber pots were emptied into palace courtyards. Infection was everywhere, and your palace, for all its beauty, was a breeding ground. Worse still, your lifestyle demanded that you ignore your health. Fevers were not a valid excuse to miss court. If you skipped a council meeting, it was interpreted as political instability. If you appeared pale, rumors spread that you were dying, and once rumors began, so did plots. People circled like vultures at the first sign of weakness, waiting to see if your cough turned into a crisis. Physicians were always nearby, but their knowledge was limited. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a mix of astrology, religious theory, and herbal guesswork. Diagnoses were based on theories of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And treatments included bloodletting, purging, induced vomiting, and burning herbs to cleanse the air. You could be cut open to drain bad vapors, or prescribed mercury for a fever. If you survived the illness, it was likely in spite of your doctor, not because of him. The physicians themselves were political actors. They competed for your trust, flattered you, and swore they could cure whatever plagued you. Many had no formal training. Some belonged to rival factions within your court. If they failed to heal you, they'd blame external forces, curses, divine punishment, or your own moral failings. Anything to avoid responsibility. But if they succeeded in making you look healthier, even briefly, they gained enormous influence, and so your body, even in illness, became another tool in the political game. There was also no reliable way to distinguish between a passing ailment and a terminal illness. A stomachache might be dysentery, a skin rash could be smallpox, a headache might be the first sign of a slow, fatal fever that medicine couldn't touch. You might go to bed with mild discomfort and wake up unable to stand. And if you did worsen, your court scrambled, not to save your life, but to secure the succession, to draft contingency plans, to begin subtle negotiations with the likely heir. And still, you were expected to appear strong. There was no public sick leave. If you missed a religious festival, the church whispered that God was displeased with you. If you skipped a royal hunt, the nobles began exchanging glances. You were expected to carry on, attend audiences, hold banquets, listen to grievances, even when you could barely keep your head upright or your food down. Some kings tried to hide their illnesses entirely, locking themselves away and issuing decrees through trusted messengers. Others forced themselves into public view, sweating through ceremonies, pale and trembling in full armor, so that their subjects wouldn't lose confidence. But the whispers came anyway. They always did. About who would take over, about whether the king was still in control, about whether the sickness was natural or helped along by someone with ambition. When plague struck, the danger multiplied. The Black Death didn't care whether you lived in a castle or a cottage. It cut through cities, towns, and courts alike. Whole royal families died within weeks. Kings who had survived war and rebellion succumbed to a single infected flea. And when disease swept through your capital, your subjects expected you to do something. Offer protection, offer prayers, offer hope, but you could offer none of those, because you were just as afraid as they were, and just as vulnerable. The truth was, for all your status, you were often more exposed than the average subject. You met with more people, touched more hands, ate food prepared by dozens of servants, slept in chambers cleaned by others, rode through towns filled with strangers. The crown did not isolate you from disease. It placed you in its path, over and over again. And when the illness finally took hold, whether in a day or over years, there was rarely dignity in it. You lost weight, lost your strength, lost control of your body. Your advisors stood back, your family wept or waited. The court turned colder. You became a symbol of decay, not just of your own body, but of the realm. And even before you died, the court had begun to shift its attention to the next in line. Because the moment a king showed signs of fading, the kingdom began the slow process of forgetting him. Power abhors a vacuum, and no one was going to wait around to see if you pulled through. Plans were made. Supporters switched allegiances, advisors hedged their bets. You were still alive, but you had already become part of the past. So no, royal blood offered no protection. It didn't matter what you wore, how many physicians you employed, or how many saints were painted on your chapel ceiling. Illness stripped away the crown like everything else. And when it came for you, it didn't knock first. Next, we look at what happened after you died. How everything you built, defended, and hoped to pass on could be dismantled within months by the very heir you trained to carry your legacy. You spent your life building a kingdom. Every treaty signed, every rebellion crushed, every coin minted with your face on it. All of it was done with one goal in mind: legacy. The idea that your name would live on, carved in stone, sung in praise, passed down through generations. But if you were a medieval king, that belief was often a lie you told yourself to cope with the reality that came after. Your death did not mark the peaceful transfer of power that royal scribes liked to imagine. It marked a scramble. The moment your final breath left your body, your court began to shift, like a well-rehearsed play changing cast mid-performance. Servants whispered in corners, nobles started choosing sides, and ministers who swore undying loyalty to your rule began drafting letters for the next king. Even before you were buried, your legacy was under review. Your heir, whether a son, a nephew, or someone more distant, might praise your name publicly, but behind closed doors they were preparing to undo everything you built, not out of hatred, necessarily, but because it was easier than living in your shadow. A new king had to make his own mark, and that often meant scrapping your policies, replacing your ministers, rewriting your laws, and blaming you for every lingering problem. You weren't remembered as the man who held the kingdom together. You were remembered as the one who left it in need of reform. Worse, if the succession wasn't clear, your death became a spark in a powder keg. Rival claimants emerged from every corner of the bloodline. Bastards raised by ambitious mothers, cousins, with just enough noble support. Foreign rulers who married into your family and now declared a right to your crown. Within weeks, the court you once ruled became a battlefield of inheritance, and your name was dragged into debates you could no longer control. They argued over what you meant, what you would have wanted, whether your final decrees were forged, whether you were even sane in your final months. Suddenly, you weren't a person anymore. You were a political symbol, a puppet of memory, twisted to fit the narrative of whoever shouted loudest. Even your body wasn't always treated with dignity. Some kings were buried in haste to avoid unrest. Others were entombed in elaborate mausoleums, only for those tombs to be raided years later, when a new regime decided your reign needed to be forgotten. Statues were toppled, coins melted down, royal insignia removed from buildings. The things you left behind weren't sacred. They were resources to be repurposed by the next administration. And if your reign had been marked by controversy, illness, or failure, your enemies didn't just bury your name, they rewrote it. Chroniclers, paid by rival nobles or new kings, recorded your failures, exaggerated your vices, downplayed your victories. You became the weak king, or the tyrant, or the mad one. The truth of your rule didn't matter. What mattered was the story that survived. Sometimes even your successes were erased. A king who reformed the treasury might be called greedy. One who kept the peace might be remembered as indecisive. A just ruler might be painted as naive. History wasn't written by the victors. It was written by the survivors, and survival often required blaming the dead. You could have ruled for 40 years, kept the realm stable, defeated invaders, built cathedrals, established schools, and still, your successor might wipe the slate clean within a month. New symbols, new advisors, new vision. They weren't interested in preserving your memory. They were interested in cementing their own. And what of your children? Even they weren't guaranteed to protect your legacy. Some resented you. Others lacked the wisdom or will to carry on what you started. Many undid your achievements not out of malice, but through incompetence. And when your policies failed under their leadership, they blamed you. My father made this mess. The old king's laws caused this. I inherited a broken realm. So you became the scapegoat, in death, just as you had been in life. And the common people? They didn't remember your speeches, your strategies, or your vision. They remembered taxes, hunger, plague, war. They remembered the year the fields flooded, or the soldiers took their livestock, or the roads were too dangerous to travel. You were not a man to them. You were a symbol of hardship, or fortune, or indifference. And their songs and stories reflected that, whether you deserved it or not. In the end, your legacy was not yours to shape. It belonged to your successors, your enemies, your scribes, and your people. You might have died believing your name would echo through the centuries, but in truth, you were just another entry in a list of kings, a crown that passed from one troubled soul to the next. So no, being king didn't guarantee remembrance. It didn't guarantee praise. And it certainly didn't guarantee truth. Because once you were gone, the only thing you could control, your legacy, was the one thing you no longer had a hand in. Next, we explore one final humbling truth. That even in life, even in full regalia, with armies at your back, and subjects at your feet, you were still just a man playing a role too large for one lifetime. You were called Majesty. Your face was stamped on coins. Your name filled scrolls and proclamations. Courtiers bowed, commoners knelt, priests invoked your health in every mass. At a glance, it seemed like you were the most important man alive, a force of destiny, chosen by heaven to rule the land. But beneath the robes, beneath the crown, beneath the ceremony and titles, you were still just a man. And every single day of your reign was spent pretending you were more than that. From the moment of your coronation, your life ceased to be your own. You didn't just rule, you performed. Your gestures, your words, your posture, your facial expressions. Everything was staged to support the illusion that you were something more than mortal. The image of kingship was as carefully constructed as a cathedral, and just as heavy. You couldn't lose your temper in public. You couldn't cry. You couldn't say I don't know. To admit confusion, grief, fear, even once, was to break the spell, because if the king was unsure, then the whole world might be. And so you learnt to wear your crown like armor, not an honor. You held audiences when you were sick. You went to war when you were exhausted. You sat through ceremonies with your joints aching, your thoughts drifting, and your nerves pulled tight, like bowstrings. No one saw the sweat under your collar, or the sleepless nights that came before the confident nod. You had to be everything: warrior, priest, judge, father, diplomat, figurehead. You were expected to embody justice, mercy, courage, and piety, all at once. But there were days when you weren't any of those things. Days when you didn't feel strong. Days when you weren't fair. Days when you simply couldn't carry the weight. And those were the days that frightened you most. Not because of what might happen, but because no one could ever know. You were constantly surrounded by people, yet utterly isolated. Everyone had expectations. Everyone had needs. Everyone wanted something from the crown: land, status, protection, favor. But who cared about the man wearing it? There were no real friendships, no conversations without consequence. You laughed with men who secretly hated you. You broke bread with those who had once fought against you. You offered forgiveness when what you really wanted was honesty. And through it all, you wore the costume, heavy, gilded, suffocating, of a man who had everything under control. Some kings broke under the pressure. Others hardened into tyrants. A few escaped into mysticism, retreating from the court into prayer, as if begging the divine to take back what had once felt like a gift, but now only resembled a burden. And yet they all kept up the act, because the world demanded it. And the truth: no one ever told you how lonely it would be. Not your tutors, not your priests, not the old kings you studied in books. They spoke of duty, legacy, glory, not the day-to-day emptiness of being revered but never known. You could command armies and still feel powerless in your own court. You could be praised by thousands and still be hated in silence. You could rule for 30 years and still go to bed wondering whether you were just a clever imposter in a gold-trimmed costume. Even your victories rarely felt like triumphs. You knew how many people had died for them, how many lies had been told to secure them, how much you'd had to compromise along the way. The crown might gleam in the sun, but it was heavy with guilt, with secrets, with sacrifices you never wanted to make. And so you lived behind a mask, and the longer you wore it, the harder it became to remember who you had been before the crown touched your head. Perhaps as a child you dreamt of ruling, imagined the power, the applause, the respect, but no dream prepared you for the reality of it. For the way your life became a series of appearances, each more carefully curated than the last. For the distance between yourself and the people you were supposed to love. For the way your own reflection looked less and less like a man, and more like a myth you could never quite live up to. You were a king. Yes, but you were also human. Flawed, frightened, tired, and the crown didn't change that. It just forced you to hide it better. Next, we step away from the throne entirely and into the lives of the people you ruled. Because while it was hard to be king, it was often even worse to be the ones under his command. If being king was a burden, then living under a king's rule often meant carrying the weight of that burden yourself, with none of the power to shift it. For the average person in medieval Europe, the king was not a distant legend carved in marble. He was a very real force who shaped their everyday lives through his taxes, his wars, his laws, and his failures. You didn't need to meet him to feel his influence. His decrees determined what you could own, where you could live, how much grain you could keep, and which punishments you might face if you broke rules you barely understood. The king decided when levies were raised, when roads were built, and when your sons would be marched off to fight in wars whose causes you didn't even know. He was a name on a charter, a face on a coin, a symbol painted on the side of the wagon collecting your taxes, and yet his decisions could ruin your life. Most people lived far from the centers of power. They didn't have access to royal courts or influence over royal policy. Justice was inconsistent. If a nobleman trampled your land or his men stole your livestock, you couldn't simply appeal to the crown. You brought your complaint to a local lord, who may have owed loyalty to the very man you were accusing. If your village resisted, your punishment could be collective. Higher taxes, violent retribution, or being left unprotected when bandits came through. When the king raised money for his wars, it was often through forced taxes, collected aggressively, without explanation. Tallage, scotage, tolls on trade, grain levies. The methods varied, but the outcome didn't. You paid. If you couldn't, your tools, animals, or food stores might be seized, and if you resisted, the consequences were brutal. It wasn't uncommon for entire towns to be punished for harboring tax dodgers, with soldiers sent in to burn property or forcibly take what was owed. And what were these taxes paying for? Most often they funded wars that didn't touch your village directly, at least not until you were conscripted. If you were a freeman, you might be called to serve in the levy. If you were a serf, your lord might send men in your place, pulling strong, able-bodied farmers from the land at harvest time. You could be marched hundreds of miles from home, sleep in the mud, die from disease before ever seeing the enemy. And if you returned, it might be to a ruined homestead and starving children. Even in peacetime, the weight of the crown was felt. The king's household demanded resources. His officials traveled the country demanding accommodation and food. Royal hunts passed through the countryside with dozens, even hundreds of men and animals, and villages were required to provide hospitality, sometimes for days. If anything was damaged or stolen, no compensation was given. The king had the right. That was enough. Worse still was the legal system, a tangle of royal law, local law, and ecclesiastical law that few commoners could understand. Trials by ordeal, judgments by lords, the whim of corrupt bailiffs. Justice depended on your status, your connections, or your ability to bribe the right official. If you were accused of a crime and couldn't read Latin, couldn't afford a fine, or couldn't offer witnesses, you might be imprisoned or mutilated without a fair hearing. If the church was involved, you might face excommunication, or be turned over to religious authorities whose punishments were harsher than anything the crown enforced. The king's peace was supposed to protect the people, but in many places, it was a thin illusion. Bandits roamed the roads. Raids from rival lords, foreign mercenaries, or even the king's own soldiers were not uncommon. You could wake up one morning to find your village under siege, not by rebels, but by men bearing the royal seal, sent to collect supplies or suppress an uprising in another province. Property could be seized. Innocent people could be executed as examples. There was no clear line between peacekeeping and extortion. And when things truly fell apart, when famine struck, when plague spread, when winter lingered too long, the king was often nowhere to be seen. He remained in the capital or moved court to a safer region, while villagers buried their dead and rationed spoiled grain. Royal assistance was rare, and when it arrived it was usually too little, too late. Grain stores controlled by lords, taxed at the king's order, or doled out to those who pledged allegiance first. People prayed for the king's health, not because they loved him, but because they feared what happened when he died. Succession was chaotic. Civil war, disputed claims, sudden purges. Every royal death threatened to turn the countryside into a battleground. A weak king meant lawlessness. A strong king meant stricter taxes. There was no winning, only surviving. So no, being ruled wasn't peace. It wasn't order. It was a constant balancing act between obedience and desperation. A village might sing the king's praises at festival, decorate the square when his heralds passed through, hang his crest over the church door. But in truth, most people lived and died at the mercy of a man they'd never see, whose name they cursed in private and invoked in public only to stay alive. And while the king wrestled with his own burdens, the people below bore the weight of his decisions, without the luxury of choosing them. Next, we'll take a darker turn and examine what happened when the king himself became the problem. When madness, cruelty, or paranoia took hold of the throne, and everyone beneath it paid the price. In a medieval kingdom, the king was the cornerstone of everything: law, order, military command, religion, diplomacy, and the very idea of national identity. When the king was strong and capable, the kingdom had a fighting chance. But when the king went mad, the consequences weren't just personal, they were catastrophic. There were no safeguards, no backup systems, no legal process for quietly removing a monarch who had lost his mind. The idea that the king could be mentally unfit wasn't something the state was designed to handle, because the state was the king. His will was law. His mood could determine the fate of cities. His fantasies might be carved into legal precedent. And once that mind began to unravel, the entire structure that supported it began to twist and collapse. In some cases, the madness crept in slowly. A king might begin to isolate himself, withdrawing from court, praying excessively, or refusing to bathe. He might mutter to himself during council meetings, stare at the floor during parades, or lash out at servants with unpredictable fury. At first, those around him would cover for it, ministers blaming stress, advisors adjusting routines, scribes quietly editing records to hide the worst of it. But the truth could only be hidden for so long. Eventually, everyone knew the man on the throne was no longer capable of ruling, and when that happened, chaos followed. In the absence of clarity, power grabs began. Ambitious nobles started positioning themselves as the true voice of the realm. Some pushed for regents to be appointed. Others plotted to control the king through advisors or family members. Factions formed, each claiming to act in the king's best interest, while really just acting in their own. Sometimes the queen stepped in, assuming power unofficially. Other times the king's children or siblings maneuvered for control. What they never did was agree. Governance turned into a tug of war, with different parts of the kingdom answering to different masters. Laws became contradictory, taxes were collected twice. Justice became arbitrary. The machinery of state, designed to serve one mind, was now responding to a dozen conflicting hands. But things could get even worse when the king's madness was not passive, but active. There were kings who ruled through delusion, paranoia, and cruelty, issuing executions for imagined plots, ordering armies to march without cause, bankrupting their treasuries chasing visions or omens. Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. Henry VI of England would forget who he was for days at a time. These weren't eccentricities, they were deep psychological fractures at the heart of national power. And when a mad king made a decree, no one could stop it. If he ordered the imprisonment of a loyal noble, it was done. If he accused a servant of treason and demanded their execution, heads rolled. If he cancelled treaties or launched invasions based on visions or dreams, entire regions were plunged into war. There were no checks, no parliament powerful enough, no church bold enough to intervene directly. The king's authority remained absolute, even when his grip on reality didn't. For the people living under such a reign, the experience was terrifying. One day might bring generous tax forgiveness, the next, a brutal levy enforced by soldiers with no explanation. A royal edict might pardon criminals one week and order the hanging of suspected witches the next. Villages could be razed on suspicion. Entire cities could suffer because a mad king remembered an insult that never happened. Trade suffered, law faltered, and fear spread like disease. Foreign powers took note. Diplomats left court whispering reports of instability. Enemies prepared invasions. Allies withdrew their support. The kingdom, once stable under a sane ruler, became a target, not because it was weak in numbers, but because its leader could no longer distinguish truth from fantasy. And within the palace, life became a daily performance. Courtiers had to walk a careful line, agreeing with madness without endorsing it, offering advice without appearing oppositional, serving a man they feared might turn on them in an instant. Ministers forged signatures, intercepted orders, and tried to quietly limit the damage. But every lie, every silent correction, every secret meeting only deepened the instability. The closer you were to the king, the more dangerous your position became. In some cases, the king's mental collapse led to full-blown civil war. The realm fractured between loyalists, rebels, opportunists, and foreign-backed claimants. Nobles dragged their armies across the countryside, peasants fled, and the entire nation paid the price for the madness of one man in a crown. When it was over, if it ended, the kingdom was rarely the same. The damage was structural, generational, permanent, yet still, many of these kings died in bed, buried with full honors, remembered in some records as troubled or unfortunate, rather than what they truly were. The human cost of a system that gave one man absolute power and no safe way to let go of it when he broke. So while most feared being ruled by a tyrant, the truth was sometimes worse. Being ruled by a king who was no longer there. A throne occupied by delusion. A realm adrift in the storm, with no one holding the wheel. Next, we look at how even the moments designed to celebrate kingship, coronations, feasts, royal weddings, often revealed the deep fragility behind the glittering surface of the crown. At a glance, kingship was dazzling. The coronation processions, the grand feasts, the jeweled regalia, the lavish tapestries, all of it crafted to display power, permanence, and divine approval. To the people watching from a distance, the crown seemed like the ultimate prize. It shimmered on a velvet pillow, resting in the hands of a bishop, kissed by tradition and ceremony. But for the man expected to wear it, all that glitter masked something far less beautiful, a life of unrelenting pressure, danger, and disillusionment. Ceremony was essential to medieval monarchy. Crowning a king wasn't just political, it was theatrical. It took place in cathedrals, under high arches, watched by nobles, clergy, and foreign dignitaries. You were anointed with holy oil, draped in centuries-old garments, handed swords and orbs and scepters, and declared chosen by God. But even during that sacred moment, the people in the crowd weren't watching for glory. They were watching for signs of weakness. Was your voice strong? Did you stumble? Did you flinch under the weight of the crown? Because no matter how divine the ritual appeared, everyone in the room was thinking politically. Some were already imagining how they might profit if your reign faltered. The same was true for royal feasts and celebrations. On the surface they were indulgent. Roast boar, wine flowing like rivers, jesters, music, dancers, intricate courses brought in on silver trays. But behind the spectacle was a constant undercurrent of calculation. Every seat placement, every toast, every nod toward a visiting lord was a message. Who was rising in favor? Who had been snubbed? Courtiers watched your every move, interpreted every smile or silence, and made alliances in whispered corners while the minstrels played. You, the king, were not the host. You were the stage. Even weddings, supposedly personal, joyous events, were political battlegrounds. Your marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances, territorial claims, dowries, and the strategic balance of power. Your bride might be young, foreign, and unfamiliar with your language, your customs, even your religion. The entire court watched to see how she bowed, what she wore, whether she appeared submissive, whether you appeared pleased. The celebrations might last days, but the marriage could last decades, and for better or worse, it was a deal you could never walk away from without severe consequences. Everything had to appear perfect. The crown was always polished, your robes carefully arranged. The royal portraits idealized your face, taller, stronger, more regal than reality allowed. Even your public prayers were performative. You knelt on cue, you raised your eyes at the right moment. Because kingship wasn't just about ruling, it was about maintaining the illusion of perfection, even as you crumbled behind the scenes. But all that sparkle, all that gold and silk and music, cost money. A single royal feast could bankrupt a small village if the court passed through. Hundreds of animals slaughtered, fountains of wine poured, extravagant gifts handed to visiting nobles to maintain appearances. And yet, if you didn't put on a proper show, people talked. They whispered that the king was weak, that the kingdom was poor, that the divine blessing had faded. You had no choice but to perform extravagance, even when your coffers were empty. Meanwhile, the people outside those castle walls lived hard lives. They wore coarse wool, ate plain bread, and worked from sunup to sundown. When they saw the glimmer of the crown, glimpsed at a distance, maybe once in their life, it looked magical, untouchable, but they never saw the exhaustion in your eyes, or the silence in your chamber when the celebration ended and your crown was placed once again on its stand. And beneath the surface of the crown itself was another truth. A crown is not designed for comfort. Many were literally heavy. Some caused headaches. They weren't worn casually. They were brought out to prove something. You wore it when you had to look invincible, even when you felt anything but. The tighter it sat on your head, the more isolated you became. The symbolism was relentless. The orb represented the Christian world, and your duty to keep it in balance. The scepter stood for justice, even as injustice surrounded you. The sword meant strength, though you sometimes felt powerless. Every item handed to you during a coronation came with expectations, and those expectations never left. Over time, even you began to believe the glitter. You started acting the part too well. You forgot how to speak plainly, forgot how to admit weakness. You became the image, not the man, and eventually, the performance consumed you. So no, the crown's glitter was not a sign of glory. It was a mask, one you wore for life. And when it broke, it didn't crack gently. It shattered everything beneath it. Next, we'll examine the darker side of kingship no one liked to talk about. The things done quietly, secretly, behind closed doors, to keep power where it didn't belong. Every crown rested on a story that a king ruled by divine right, that his authority was natural, noble, and pure. But behind every story was a far messier truth. Power was never clean. It wasn't earned by virtue or maintained through goodness. It was clawed into place, held there by threat, deception, and more often than not, quiet brutality. And if you were a medieval king, that reality followed you everywhere, whether you admitted it or not. At the highest levels of rule, power meant compromise. You couldn't enforce your will through kindness. You couldn't govern a kingdom with idealism alone. The nobles didn't stay loyal because they believed in your right to rule. They stayed loyal because they feared what would happen if they did. That fear had to be fed, not with constant cruelty, but with just enough force to remind them who was at the top. You signed death warrants. You oversaw torture chambers. You allowed spies to intercept letters, spread disinformation, frame rivals. You exiled dissenters, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. And every time you looked the other way, every time you said, "Let it be done," you knew a line had been crossed. But you also knew that line had to be crossed, or someone else would do it for you. You dealt with the church not as a matter of faith, but as a political entity. You made pacts with bishops, brokered influence, and turned sacred offices into rewards for loyalty. When the Pope resisted you, you considered installing your own candidate. When monasteries grew too wealthy or independent, you found ways to pressure them, not out of impiety, but because every corner of your realm had to be brought under control. The holy and the political were indistinguishable, and pretending otherwise was naive. If God was said to put you on the throne, then God's ministers were part of your machinery, or they were a threat. You spied constantly. Every court had its informants, and you needed yours. Servants were bribed. Courtiers were watched. Letters were read, copied, sealed again, and delivered late. Your advisors reported whispers from banquets, clues from tone and gesture. Sometimes it felt absurd, chasing rumors, reacting to shadows. But the one rumor you ignored could be the one that cost you everything. And when a rebellion began to stir, and they always did, eventually, you didn't wait. You preemptively arrested suspected conspirators, sometimes without proof. You ordered executions for treason, where the evidence was hearsay at best. You displayed bodies at the city gates, left traitors' heads on spikes, drowned women suspected of sorcery. You burned letters, erased records, altered history as it was being written, not for the sake of justice, but for stability. Sometimes you had to punish the innocent to discourage the guilty. Sometimes you exiled allies before they could betray you. Sometimes you spared your enemies not out of mercy, but because fear of them kept others in line. Power was a series of cold calculations, and there were no clean answers. Even within your own family, the dirt ran deep. Brothers who smiled at your coronation later raised armies against you. Sons who swore loyalty questioned your sanity behind your back. Daughters were married off to allies, one week, and held as bargaining chips the next. Bastards had to be legitimized or silenced. Every bloodline decision, every heir chosen or bypassed, created ripples that could tear apart your reign. And sometimes, to stop a future war, you had to start a smaller one now. The men around you, the ones who helped you stay on the throne, weren't saints either. They ran blackmail rings. They arranged assassinations. They cleaned up noble scandals before they reached the wider court. You knew it happened. Sometimes you gave direct orders. Other times you gave no orders at all. Just the silence that allowed it to continue. When their work was done, you praised them in public and looked them in the eye, at dinner, knowing full well they had committed acts you could never speak aloud. But what choice did you have? Ruling cleanly wasn't ruling at all. It was how naive kings ended up dead. overthrown, or disgraced. You learned quickly that cleanliness was a luxury you couldn't afford, not if you wanted to keep the peace, not if you wanted to preserve your dynasty, and after a while, you stopped asking whether something was right or wrong. The question became, does this protect the crown, or not? Still, there were nights when you lay awake, staring into the dark, thinking of the things that had been done in your name, the people silenced, the bodies buried, the promises broken, and you asked yourself, not for the first time, did you really rule this kingdom, or did you simply survive it? Because while the records might show a reign of 20 or 30 years filled with edicts and treaties and triumphs, what they never captured was what it cost to maintain that thin veneer of order, not just to others, but to you. Next, in our final section, we'll step back from the details and ask the ultimate question. After all the fear, power, ceremony, and silence, was it ever truly worth it to wear the crown? When the crown was first placed on your head, it may have felt like destiny. As trumpets rang out and crowds roared your name, you told yourself you had arrived, not just as a ruler, but as something greater than a man. You were the embodiment of the kingdom, the heir to legends, the hand of God on earth. And yet, years later, as your hair grayed, your body ached, and your sleep turned restless, that moment felt like a distant echo, the beginning of a performance that never truly ended. For all its glory, kingship demanded everything and gave back almost nothing. You lived surrounded by people, but knew real companionship rarely lasted. You had ministers, soldiers, family, and lovers, but few of them ever saw you as more than a vessel of power. You carried secrets that no one else could be trusted with. You made choices that haunted you in silence. You had to be just when justice was impossible, generous when your kingdom was broke, fearless when your soul was exhausted, and even when you gave everything you had, your youth, your health, your peace of mind, it was never enough to keep what you had built from slipping through your fingers. Every victory came at a cost. Every reform created enemies. Every act of mercy was taken as weakness. You were praised, yes, in songs, in sermons, in speeches, but behind closed doors, people plotted. They smiled as they betrayed you. They stood as you passed, but secretly counted the days until your crown passed on. You lived under constant pressure to appear in control. Your meals were ceremonies. Your clothing was costume. Your words were performance. Even your most private moments were rehearsed. And yet, you had no script. Every day brought new threats, new expectations, new choices that could either preserve your rule or send the entire realm into revolt. You had advisors, but never certainty. You had armies, but never peace of mind. And what of the people you ruled? They didn't know you, not truly. To most, you were a tax they couldn't escape, a name they blamed when harvests failed or soldiers came knocking. Even when you tried to protect them, they resented your power. And when you died, they mourned or celebrated not the man, but the role, the institution, the shift in fate that came with a new name atop the throne. You may have believed you were building a legacy, that your laws, your wars, your vision would live beyond you. But legacies were fragile. One incompetent heir, one war, one famine, and everything you built could vanish. Statues crumbled, histories were rewritten, your victories reinterpreted, your faults magnified. You became a lesson or a warning, depending on who wrote the next chapter, and the people who claimed to honor your name might do so only to justify their own ambitions. You couldn't retire, you couldn't step down. The crown clung to you like a weight, heavy when worn, impossible to put aside. When your body began to fail, the court began to circle. Power slipped from your hands before your pulse had even stopped. And in the final moments, surrounded by incense and whispers, even you had to wonder, was any of it ever really yours? Because in truth, you never ruled completely. You were always balancing between factions, between nations, between the church and your own nobles, between your will and your limits. The world was always slightly out of reach. You could see it, shape it, strike at it, but never fully control it. So, what remained? Not glory, not peace, not truth. Only the knowledge that the crown, the thing everyone else saw as a reward, had in fact been a kind of captivity. One that isolated you, distorted you, and demanded everything while promising nothing. a title you could never outrun, a weight you could never put down. No, it wasn't worth it. Not for the fear, not for the lies, not for the sleepless nights, the poisoned food, the fragile alliances, not for the family torn apart by inheritance, not for the people you buried, not even for the throne when it was yours. Because in the end, being king didn't mean being above others. It just meant falling alone.